As a historian, I often find myself explaining to people that all of the graduate training entailed in getting a PhD wasn't meant to give me all of the answers. I don't know everything about history, even about the topics I've focused a lot on. Instead, much of that training was to help me know what questions to ask when presented with a primary source, a letter, a journal entry, or say, a photograph. Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brendan Rensink. This month we speak with historian Martha A. Sandweiss about her book, The Girl in the Middle, A Recovered History of the American West. Sandweiss's exploration of an 1868 photograph taken at Fort Laramie is a masterclass in demonstrating how, if the right questions are asked, we can use a historical artifact to unlock dazzling historical narratives that might otherwise be hidden to our view. Here we should not only be excited by the histories she tells, but by the methods she uses. Because we all have an old family photo that we could use to launch our own investigations. Thanks for listening. For new listeners, here's a brief introduction to the podcast and myself. Writing Westward is a monthly podcast featuring conversations with historians, journalists, scientists, and scholars from various disciplines who are writing about the North American West. The goal of these exchanges is to spark your curiosity to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the peoples who have called it home. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rensink, serve as Associate Director and I'm a Professor of History. For better or worse, this is a one-man operation. I am the host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, all roles for which I have zero training. But I am passionate about the North American West, and I'll take any excuse to read more and talk to interesting people who are writing about the region. If a guest intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. If you have a moment, please subscribe and leave reviews wherever you get your podcasts. Share links with friends and follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or X, Twitter, and send in some feedback. At the end of the episode, I will include some more information about my own scholarship and the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. That's right, we may want to give you money. And with that, let me introduce who we are talking to this month and why. Martha A. Sandweiss is Professor Emerita of History from Princeton University, where she taught from 2009 to 2022. Prior to that, she was a professor of American Studies and History at Amherst College, and for a time a curator of photography at the Ammon Carter Museum. Sandweiss holds a BA in American History and Literature from Harvard University and a master's, MPhil, and PhD in History from Yale University. In addition to her varied and prodigious scholarly career, Sandweiss founded and directed the Princeton and Slavery Project. She is the author and editor of 13 books. To highlight just a few, her co-edited 1994 Oxford History of the American West won the Western Heritage Award from the National Cowboy Hall of Fame and the Coffee Award from the Western History Association. Her 2002 book, Print the Legend, Photography and the American West, won the Ray Allen Billington Award from the Organization of American Historians and the William P. Clements Award from Southern Methodist University, as well as the Barbara Sutler Award from Colorado Historical Society. Her 2009 book, Passing Strange, A Gilded Age Tale of Love and Deception Across the Color Line, was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Award, an honorable mention for the Merle Cuddy Award from the Organization of American Historians, and named one of the 10 best books of the year in the New York Times. Today we discuss her most recent book, The Girl in the Middle, A Recovered History of the American West, published in 2025 by Princeton University Press, and which was shortlisted for the Cundill Prize. As a historian who has focused much of her scholarly attention to photography, Sandweiss approaches her subject in The Girl in the Middle with a very sharp eye. She knows which questions to ask of the central photograph in question, an 1868 shot at Fort Laramie that features 6 federal peace treaty commissioners flanking a young Native girl in the middle. The men's names and histories are known, but the girl's was not. Sandweiss recovers her story and name along with its entanglements with the men who flanked her. This is remarkable historical detective work, astonishing in its breadth, depth, and nuanced complexity. It demonstrates how a single physical artifact, in this case a photograph, can be used as a new entry point to old histories. Sandweiss shows how asking new questions of old subjects can not only bring new voices to our historical understandings, but completely alter how we interpret old, well-known ones. This text also illustrates the power of critical historical thinking, not just taking a primary source like a photograph at face value and leaving it at that, but interrogating the lives of the photographer and the photographed subjects, asking why it was staged the way it was, and perhaps more importantly, exploring the resulting historical memories and historical forgettings or erasure of that moment. There's a template here for historians in any field that are looking to recover lost or erased voices and experiences, especially of marginalized peoples, and the role that dominant societies played in choosing which histories are maintained and why some are not. Martha Sandweiss, welcome to Writing Westward.
Thanks so much for having me, Brendan.
I thought maybe we should start by getting to know a little bit about you and your personal history with the West and kind of the path that led you to becoming a Western historian.
Well, it wasn't a very straight path, I can tell you that. I grew up in St. Louis, the gateway to the West, and I think I grew up thinking history is what happened far away from me. It didn't really occur to me I grew up in a place where history happened as well. I made my way to college on the East Coast. Went to graduate school to become a colonial American historian. And while I was in graduate school, through a case really of mistaken identity, I was offered a job as a curator of photographs at a museum of American art that focused on the West in Fort Worth, Texas. And I took that job, fools plunge in. And while I was working there at the Eamon Carter Museum, I became increasingly focused on the West. I retrospectively changed my dissertation topic to write about a Western topic that related more closely to my new career. And then I was off and running. The West it was.
I have a similar story. The West was the last topic I wanted to study, and here I am. Who would have thought?
To the best of us.
I know. Be careful, students. Be careful, what classes you take or what jobs you take, because it may lead you down unexpected paths. I think in our case, down some great paths, though. So
I'm so happy I ended up here instead of in colonial history.
So as you kind of became then a historian who, a lot of your work has been about photographs, the photographic history and the history of photography. This is going to take some unique methodologies that I don't think I was necessarily trained in. What are some of the skills or tools or methodologies that you've employed to help you use photographs or to interpret and interrogate a photograph to help us understand kind of broader historical narratives?
That's a good question. And let me be clear right at the outset, I was never trained to do this either. I really came to it through self-education and through on-the-job training. As I mentioned, my first job was as a curator of photographs. And I ended up at a museum that had, oh gosh, maybe 100,000 photographs in the collection. Many of them were historical images. And you never knew what a day could bring. A photograph could just show up on your desk in the morning. It might be brought by a collector. It might be something somebody found in the storage vaults or the archives. It might be presented to you by a dealer. And by the afternoon, you had to have figured it out. So it was really trial by error. How do you figure this out? I think, like you, most graduate students these days are still taught how to interrogate a literary source. And you ask who, what, when, where, why. You can start with the photograph by asking very similar questions: who, what, when, where, why. And in some cases, and we can talk about this later, how? How was this picture made? Why was it made? Who made it? Who paid them to make it? How did it circulate? And what has the history of that picture been since it was created? So the questions are really very similar to the questions we might ask of literary documents, but sometimes you just have to have a little bit more knowledge, say, about the history of photography. Otherwise, the questions are very, very similar.
Are there a different set of tools that you use when asking those questions? Like, we have a family history major here, and when I talk to these genealogy students, their little toolkit that they use to go through census records, and it's dazzling. They have some skills that I don't have. Even though they're often asking the same questions I am, they come at them with a different set of tools. What are some unique skills or tools that the rest of us should be trying to develop or look for so that we can interrogate a photograph effectively?
Well, I think we can get into that as we talk about my book, which is about one photograph that came to me with a huge mystery right at the heart of it. But let me talk about my relationship to genealogists for just a moment. I am incredibly grateful for the work that genealogists do. I think that genealogists sometimes see the trees and don't always see the forests. Sometimes historians see the forest but don't always see the trees. So I think that more general historians have a lot to learn by working with genealogists who often are preserving, not just in their research, but in their private archives and collections, the stuff that we need to write really rich, insightful histories.
Let's get to the photograph then. And we'll get into the history of the photograph kind of at the center of your book. But for the listening audience, can you describe it visually? And then, I mean, we'll get into it later, but like, what should they have in their mind?
Well, let me start by saying everybody's heard the old adage, a picture is worth
1,000
a
words. Yeah, yeah,
thousand.
yeah.
Right. Well, I've heard that for a long time, but unfortunately, I just didn't pay attention because it honestly took me about 140,000 words to write an entire book about one photograph, the picture you're asking about here. So let me describe it to listeners who can't see it for themselves. It's a photograph, I'm not going to say more about it yet, that depicts 6 white men standing in groups of 3 to either side of a young girl. The white men are variously dressed in both business and military attire. The child standing in the middle of them is wrapped in a trade blanket, and she would appear to be Native American. That's what you see.
And it looks like they're in a field, perhaps. There's maybe a clearing in a field, like a tall grass prairie field or corn or something.
Yeah, some of what I'm going to say now is knowledge I bring to the picture. It's not actually what you see. But yes, you're right. They're standing in a rather nondescript field. I know from the date the picture is made and from weather data from this place that it's the dried up stubble of last year's grass. I know that the new grass fields haven't yet greened up. It's a picture made the first week of May. So what you see is just that image. But I have also seen that image as it was printed and distributed in the 19th century. And because I've seen not just the negative and what I use on the cover of my book is a image made directly from the original negative, but I know from the print, I know many more things. I know that the picture was made by Alexander Gardner, the celebrated Civil War photographer, celebrated photographer of Abraham Lincoln. I know that it was made at Fort Laramie in 1868. I know that the men there are members of a federal peace commission sent west to force the Lakota and some of the other Northern Plains tribes onto newly created reservations. And I know, because I've seen probably not all of the extant copies of the print, but many of them, if not most of them, I know who the men are. On the left, we see General Alfred Terry, the man who would later discover Custer and all of his men dead on the battlefield at Little Bighorn. Next to him is the evil General William Harney, the villain of my story, and we can get into his villainy later. Next to him is the only person in the photograph viewers might recognize, and it's General Sherman, who, of course, commanded Union troops during the Civil War.
Even in profile, I think I recognized him.
He has a very distinctive
Yeah.
face. Then comes the little girl. Then to the right of the child is a man named General John Sanborn, whom, unless you're from Minneapolis, St. Paul, you're not going to know his name, but he ended up becoming a lawyer and a man about town there. Next to him, Colonel Samuel F. Tappan, a noted abolitionist. And on the far right, the wonderfully named Christopher Columbus Augur, the general who commanded the military district of Washington, D.C. at the end of the Civil War and guarded access to President Lincoln's deathbed as the president lay dying after the assassination. On the extant prints of the picture, where Gardner is identified as the photographer, where the photograph is identified as part of a series he made called Scenes in Indian Country, The men are always identified in handwriting, whether it's probably Gardner's, and the girl is never identified. On one print, she's called Arapaho. On the negative itself, it just says Dakota. And my project really started with the simplest question: could I figure out who she is?
Where did you first encounter the photograph?
I'd seen the picture used as an illustration in books about the Indian Wars and books about Indian treaty processes. It's really part of a series. It's really the only real extant series of photographs that documents the treaty making process in the late 19th century. And the project really began. I just, my last book was about the secret life of the explorer Clarence King. And I had a lot of fun asking questions nobody had ever asked about his secret family. And I loved that kind of digging around. But I am also, as you noted, a photo historian. And I began to wonder, could I bring these two interests of mine together in a new project? And I thought, let me find 5, 10 photographs made in the United States during the 19th century. Railroads, Civil War, gold mining, Indian Wars, whatever. And let me see if I can identify some of the unnamed figures in those pictures. And I wanted to know if we could identify those people, would our understanding of the pictures change? Well, I pretty quickly realized if anybody could identify those dead soldiers at Antietam or Gettysburg, it would be a military history buff. But I began working on this photograph, and it took me quite a long time to identify the child. But once I did, I knew I didn't have to write about 5 pictures. One was going to be enough.
Yeah, it was going to be a whole book. Some photographs just kind of automatically prompt innumerable questions, but for me, there was a few central ones that crowded out anything else I may have been wondering, and that is this strange staging of these men flanking this young girl. Some of them are facing her, but don't appear to be looking at her. It's just a peculiar staging of a photograph, which then makes me ask, so why is she in the middle? Is she important? And as you kind of hinted, like, so who is she? Did she matter somehow? Uh,
And then you could be a photo historian. You're asking all the questions I asked at the outset. You're absolutely right. The pose of the picture is completely bizarre, and it's extremely symmetrical. The two men standing immediately to either side of the girl look at one another over her head. They don't glance at her. They don't put a reassuring arm on her back. The two men outside of them look more or less towards the camera, and the two men on the outside of the picture, again, look inward. It's a very weird pose. But that girl in the middle, she looks straight at the photographer's lens.
and it's not even a staging. Like, sometimes old photos had certain ways that people would pose, especially in the era where they had to stand still for a long time, right?
Mhm.
This is not a pose that I've seen before. Very, very peculiar.
The photographer orchestrated the picture. These men wouldn't have just fallen into this particular pose. And if you look long enough at the little girl, and I'll get to in a moment to who she is, her legs look improbably long. And I think that she's actually standing on a little crate or box that you can't see because her long tray blanket goes all the way down to the ground. So the photographer, in a way, has used her to create a sense of scale. She's much shorter than the men, but he's also raised her up a little bit so that the picture doesn't look just too weird.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get to who she is in a minute, but when I then read that she's 8 years old, I thought, well, that actually surprised me because in my head, I had her as kind of a teenager. If it's because of the height, right? If she was an
Right.
eight-year-old girl, she would be a good another foot shorter, I think.
Yeah. Well, at least 6 inches or so. Yeah.
Yeah,
Once
yeah,
she adds in that box under her feet, everything falls into place and her
yeah.
head looks proportionately right to her body.
Well, let's talk about this photographer who staged this, and we can't know exactly why he staged it this way. Can you give us kind of a thumbnail sketch of who Alexander Gardner was leading up to this moment in 1868?
Sure. And then we'll circle back around to who the
Yeah.
girl really is. So Gardner was born in Scotland. He was born before photography was even invented. So there are no photographs that document his early life. He trained as a watchmaker, a kind of mechanic. So he was good with his hands and good with tools. In the late 1840s, he and some family members and some other tradesmen in and around Glasgow decided they wanted to move to the United States to form a utopian colony. They lived in Glasgow, a city that was industrializing, factories, the waterfront is changing on the river. They wanted to remove themselves from society and create a more perfect world. For various reasons, Gardner and his wife were unable to leave with the other colonists. But those other colonists eventually settled on recently vacated native land in Iowa. And they created the Clydesdale colony, a utopian colony that honestly didn't last very long because a bunch of Scottish tradesmen were no match for the Iowa weather. They weren't the kinds of farmers who could weather some bad seasons of rain and cold. We don't actually know how Gardner became a photographer. Many previous biographers have argued with certainty they know how, but when you go back to the records, we really don't know how. He ends up in Washington, D.C. In the early 1850s. Bizarrely, his wife and children have preceded him by at least a year or two. Before emigrating, Gardner is editing a kind of socialist newspaper in Scotland. So he's a journalist and a publisher. But he ends up in New York, and before long, he's working for the celebrated Matthew Brady, perhaps the greatest American photographer of the day. And by the late 1850s, he's running Brady's studio in Washington, D.C. So he's like Zelig. He meets everybody. He's photographing generals, politicians, soldiers before they embark on the Civil War. He goes out to the killing fields of Antietam and Gettysburg to photograph the bodies. Of course, photographers couldn't photograph a battle itself at this moment, but they could photograph the aftermath of it. He photographs Lincoln. He photographs the Lincoln conspirators, and he photographs their execution. The Civil War was an incredible opportunity for him, and he really made his name as a war photographer. But then what? The war ends. And he has to reinvent himself as a businessman. So in 1867, he accepts a job and he travels west for the first time with what would become the Kansas Pacific Railroad, known at the time as the Union Pacific Eastern Division. And he photographs their route across Kansas. And then the following year, 1868, he's out west yet again with this federal peace commission that's trying to push Native peoples onto reservations.
You also write about how he's kind of a pioneer of what today we would call photojournalism. So not just taking photographs to capture a moment, but to tell a story. And you write about how he, like at those Civil War battlefields, like they moved bodies around to try to pose things a little bit. You write about how I think maybe one you could describe, which is interesting, is how he photographed Native children in a boarding school to try to tell a story through the image. Can you kind of explain what you mean by that?
Well, let's remember that Gardner was a newspaper man before he became a photographer. So he understood what it meant to explain to people what remote or distant events were like. He started out using words, but I think that experience served him well as a photographer. And you're right to draw attention to that connection there. So in the Civil War, he was showing people what happened, even though they couldn't see it for themselves. Ditto with the pictures he made across Kansas, where he did photograph children standing in front of an Indian boarding school. Interestingly, he's often known now for something called, I'm just blanking on the name of it, the big Civil War album that he produced after the war. It was two volumes.
Yeah, is it scenes from
the photographic sketchbook?
There we go, sketchbook, yeah.
And in that, he married 100 photographs with explanatory text. It was kind of a history. It was kind of a newspaper report. It was done retrospectively, so we already knew who the winners were, etc. I challenge in this book. I challenge for the very first time the widely accepted idea that he was the author of those captions, that he was absolutely the publisher of that project. So he understood how to put photographs out into the world with texts that explained what they were about and to enlist the curiosity of a new audience.
So when he arrives at Fort Laramie in 1868, explain to us, quickly, like, why are they there? What's the context? And by extension, what stories is maybe he thinking he's going to tell through the many photographs he takes there, with the one in question included?
So this particular peace commission had been created by Congress the year before in 1867. And let's back up for a moment and think about, we're in the moment of what we call Reconstruction here. We're reconstructing the United States of America after the conclusion of the long and bloody Civil War. And the stories about Reconstruction often focus on how we would bring the freed people into American society. Each of the men in this picture had been involved in that project. Each of the men in this picture had been in the Civil War, and they'd been involved in one way or another with figuring out how to bring the recently freed Black people into the United States as more full citizens. But Reconstruction had another part, too. It's also a moment when the federal government is trying to figure out how to bring Native peoples into the United States, or at least figuring out what their relationship to the rest of the nation should be. And these men are embarked on that project. The year before, they had negotiated some treaties with tribes on the southern plains and created new reservations down and around Oklahoma. And now in 1868, they're back out in the field trying to persuade the Lakotas, the Northern Arapahoes, the Crows, to move on to reservations that they are now creating basically in present-day South Dakota. And they had the military to back them up if the Native people didn't want to sign these treaties. What Gardner is doing there, the evidence is very scant, but he seems to have been employed by the commission itself. He made about 100 large pictures, like the one that the book is about. And he made more stereographs, small two-part pictures that people could look at through special viewers, that really are the first photographic documentation we have of life within a Native camp during this period. We see women cooking, fleshing hides, dressing meat, et cetera, et cetera. So anthropologists quite value those smaller pictures. The larger ones are largely these more formal portraits.
This is all important context, and from that, there's all kinds of things that we could probably fairly accurately assume about this girl without knowing her name, right? And setting aside that one caption that, or the captions that misidentified her, as we find out, as Arapaho or Dakota. But there's some general things we could assume about a Native girl at Fort Laramie in 1868. Are there really important things before we find out who she is that we should keep in mind about, like, what her situation would have been, 1868, Native girl on the plains?
Yes. I think there's a number of ways we might try to interpret this picture without knowing the child's identity. We might look at the picture and go, oh, she's dark complected, the men are white. She's a girl, they're men. She's young, they're old. Some of them are in military dress, she's wrapped in a trade blanket. All of those observations might lead us to think, okay, the photographer is making a photograph that talks about inequality, or the many kinds of inequality that existed in American society in 1868. But I am a historian who doesn't believe in generalizations like that. I don't want to put presumptions inside my photographer's head. And so I needed more. I really needed to know her name before I could begin to think about what this photograph is all about. And let me add one thing there, Brendan, because this goes back to your original question about the tools we bring when we're thinking about a photograph. Alexander Gardner made hundreds and thousands of pictures. And through those pictures, we can know where he was on a particular day. He was at Antietam on this day, Gettysburg at this day, Central Kansas on this day, Fort Laramie on this day. But he left almost no writing. So we can know where he was, which is actually rare when you're working on many 19th century American historical figures, but we don't know what he was thinking. And I am not about to tell you or my readers what he was thinking. I'm just not going to go there. I think it's wrong. This goes back again to the the tools we need to interpret these pictures. I think it's wrong to imagine that expressions in the 19th century were read the same way they are now. For example, you might know that in some cultures it's rude to look someone in the eye. Okay. We don't always know what was appropriate in the 19th century or what a particular gesture indicated. And it's wrong to assume that a gesture in 1868 means exactly the same thing that gesture means now. It might, but it might not.
Yeah, we don't want to project onto this photograph, our current understandings. Yeah.
Exactly. So I wanted to know who this girl was. So at first I thought maybe she's the daughter of one of the many chiefs or headmen who came into Fort Laramie over the course of 2 months to sign a treaty. I thought maybe she's a translator, a very young translator. At that time, I didn't know how old she was because I knew that the commissioners had used a woman as a translator in Arapaho country on the Southern Plains the year before. But I delved into the official papers of the commission, and I quickly learned who the translators were. None of them were women. I looked for references to the headmen or chiefs who were coming into the fort. None of them mentioned their daughter. I read the personal papers of the men in the picture. I read probably all of the newspaper accounts of these treaty negotiations. Nothing. And then I got a lucky break. In the archives at Fort Laramie, which is now a National Historic Site run by the National Park Service, I found a little note card. And in the 1970s, a man named Eddie Ryan had come through the fort, looked at a copy of this picture and said, "I know who that is. It's my grandma." And her name was Sophie Mousseau. Wow. Mr. Ryan was no longer alive for me to interview, but with his name and her name, I could quickly see that he was 30 years old when his grandmother died. So it was reasonable to imagine he could have could have known what she looked like as a child. And you're a historian, you know this, and this circulates back to your question about the genealogy community. Names are everything. Names are what connect people to the archives. Names are how you find people in the historical records. And now I had a name. I had to prove whether it was the right name or not, but I had a name. So I quickly learned that Mousseau is still a common name on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And I sent a copy of this photograph to the local paper, the Lakota Times, and asked them if they would run it with a query. I just said, I believe the girl in this picture to have been born Sophie Mousseau. I would love to hear from any descendants. And I did. I've been in touch with, I think, 4 descendants from Sophie's very large and very complicated family. And I would say right at the outset, although they have some scattered records, some old and really fading stories, they have no other photographs of her. So they want this to be Sophie quite as much as I want this to be Sophie. And I'd add that though I have recovered Sophie's story, and we can get into it because it's an extraordinary story, I don't own Sophie's story. And it's been a pleasure and honor to share with the family members the documents I've found, the stories I've written, and it's their story too.
I think it's really fascinating how the questions that you have when you don't know her name, because there's a specific set of questions like why didn't they record it, and what does this tell us about women and children being ignored in the historical record? All kinds of things that are specific to the fact that we don't know her name. But once you discovered her name, I mean, I think you write. I don't know if I wrote down the exact quote, but towards the end of the book, you say that this changes everything. Once we know her name, it changes the project. It changes the questions you can ask. And as you already mentioned, all of the types of records, the research techniques, everything is different once you have a name to run with.
Yeah. If we don't know her name, we can go, it's not just about power inequities, but she does remind us that the men in the picture were sons, they were husbands, they were fathers, they were brothers. Her presence reminds us we should ask about these men. And I do that in the book a bit. Some of these men have incredible stories. But when we do know her name, you're right, everything changes. And among the things we discover is that she has a connection to some of the men in these pictures, which likely the photographer didn't know himself. And that comes to another thing that really intrigued me as I was writing this book. This book has two big challenges. One, how do you write a narrative history about a picture that records a split second of time? Gardner was there. He was an eyewitness. He met these people. He knew what they smelled like. He knew what their voices sounded like. He knew what language the little girl spoke that day, because she could have spoken one or maybe three languages. But he doesn't know where these people came from or where they're going to end up. And I'm a historian, so I have a kind of superpower. I can see where they were, and I can see what's going to happen to them. So there's that. It's a challenge. And the thing is, I just know things that the people in the picture don't know about one another. And I can see connections among them that they don't know.
This is what really blew my mind is, I mean, because I would probably normally just ask, what did you discover, once you knew her name, what did you discover about her life or her family that would change how we interpret this photograph? But after reading through the whole book, what really blew me away was the entanglements that are not visible in this picture, but you as a historian have seen, that we're able to find all the ways in which their lives did not just intersect at this moment, but that before and after there were connection points that maybe they didn't even realize at the time. You already mentioned that, so she has a connection maybe specifically to Harney,
Yeah.
the kind of the big baddie. To tell us that little story about how he actually is not that he's responsible for her existing, but he contributed to the set of factors that led to her family forming in a way.
Yeah. So, Brendan, I think there's two kinds of historians. There's parachutists and truffle hunters, and I'm borrowing those terms from the French historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie. So a parachutist floats up high and is looking for big patterns, how ideas or pathogens or people spread across vast areas of time and space. But I'm afraid of heights, and so I am a truffle hunter. I'm a person who likes to dig down in the dirt in what I call my research rabbit holes, and sometimes it's really hard to get out of them, but sometimes they really pay off. So let's talk about General Harney. He's standing tall, proud, 6'3", erect in this photograph, staring right at the photographer. He's a person that the Lakota sometimes called, in the Lakota language, woman killer. And with good reason. He was not only cruel and evil on the battlefield, he had actually murdered an enslaved woman in his household in St. Louis in the early 1830s and quite literally gotten away with murder. Down in one research rabbit hole, I discovered this story. 13 years before this picture was made in 1868, so in 1855, at a place along the Overland Trail in western Nebraska, at a site now called Blue Water, Harney led a vindictive massacre of a peaceful Lakota encampment. And his men shot a young Lakota mother named Yellow Woman in the leg, and they took her infant child and used it for target practice. I say it because I don't know if it was a boy or a girl. He then rounded up Yellow Woman and the other survivors of this massacre and marched them 120 miles or so into Fort Laramie. In that same raid, Harney and his men discovered that the Lakota had ammunition that had been traded or sold to them by the French-Canadian traders who dominated and controlled the trade in this part of the plains. So he ordered all of those French-Canadian traders to be rounded up and brought to Fort Laramie, where he could keep track of them. So in 1855, the young mother named Yellow Woman is in Fort Laramie, and a French-Canadian trader named M.A. Mousseau is brought into Fort Laramie as a direct result of that massacre. They meet, they marry, they become Sophie's parents, and they remain married for over half a century. So the general, in a crazy way, was an accidental matchmaker. And I don't tell that story to excuse the horrible violence of that massacre, but I do tell it to caution people to imagine that sometimes from horrific things, good events can spiral out.
How does that, because I would assume at the moment, Harney did not realize that this girl was in a way a product of these horrific events that he had been a party to. And she may have known his name and reputation.
Well, I think let's back up. When we see this girl in this picture, we have to imagine that her father or her mother is nearby, just out of range of the camera lens. Her father had actually worked for General Harney at various moments in the past, so he would have recognized him. Harney had looked much the same for the last few decades, so I think we have to imagine that Sophie's mother might have recognized this man too. What did Sophie know? We don't know. Had she ever asked why her mother limps? Had they ever told her the story of a half-sibling who had been murdered before she was born? Those are things we just simply can't know. But I think her parents knew who that man was when they allowed the daughter to pose here.
Unclear if Harney remembered who they were, though.
We really don't know. But then we have to ask, why is the girl in the picture, right? We establish maybe who she is. Why is she there? Well, one reason, and again, I don't know, but I'm going to spin out a few possibilities. One is the gardener wanted her there because her presence makes the picture much more visually interesting. A small native child in the midst of 6 big white peace commissioners. It makes you stop and look at this picture. It also provides a sense of scale because, as we discussed before, you don't see any big trees or buildings. You don't see the fort in the background of this picture. We're just kind of lost. It's possible that Sophie's father wanted her there. The Mousseau family is actually in Fort Laramie at this moment, I learned by digging into the records, because they had just survived a terrible raid on their road ranch outside of the fort. They had lost everything, their horses, their home, their hay, their household goods, and they had fled to the fort for safety. Sophie's father may have seen General Harney and thought, I worked for him before, and I really need some work now. Let me cooperate by allowing my daughter to pose. Standing next to Sophie on the other side is a man named John Sanborn, and he plays a role here too, because some weeks before this picture was made, somehow, he's a lawyer, his agents had found Sophie's father out there. His home has just been destroyed, and have offered to represent him in claims against the federal government to receive reparations for the material he lost to a raiding native band. So he may have wanted to prove that his clients were in Fort Laramie, where, I will note, they said they saw their horses. So the Indians who had raided them many years in the past had brought those horses in with them to the fort, and Mousseau recognized them. But I'll tell you the story I like to believe, and then again, I'm a historian, I don't have evidence for this, I can't say it, is that Sophie wanted to be there. She had a number of younger siblings. It's completely chaotic at the fort right now. There's thousands and thousands of native peoples coming and going, setting up camps. There's stray dogs. There's corrals filled with horses. There's cook fires. There's smoke. There's a cacophony of languages. And she's probably busy all day long keeping track of her little siblings. And here, for one magical afternoon, she gets to do something her siblings don't get to do. She gets to go out with her parents, pose for this strange man with a strange device called a camera, and do something special.
There's just so many potential. I mean, don't you just wish that you could turn the camera at 360 degrees and see, like, are the parents standing there watching? Do they look nervous? Are they excited? There's just so much that is not captured
That's
in this
such a great
image, right?
Yeah, that's such a great point, Brenda, because we tend to think that photographs give us this special access to the past and confer a deep understanding on us. But you're absolutely right. Like, what's just to the side? What's just back behind? What happened 5 minutes before? What happens 5 minutes after? Photographs give us a glimpse. We can see what people were wearing on a certain day, but they don't really capture the moment for us in a fuller way.
This is what makes historical research so exciting. There's the adage that, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know, right? For every data point, every photograph or historical document, to the trained eye, and the honest historian, who doesn't claim to just know everything, for every data point, we become aware of the innumerable missing data points or things that we don't have, right?
Yeah.
Which makes the work exciting. It's like you already kind of mentioned a little bit like detective work, trying to discover some of those other data points. And
Yeah, and this is so interesting because, once you have Sophie's name, once you have a name you can take back to the archives, it turns out that we can actually know more about her than we can know about most girls born in this part of the world in 1860. Why? Her father lives a long time, and he lives long enough to become one of those old timers that journalists and historians seek out to hear stories about the old days. Her father turns litigious, and he files multiple lawsuits against the federal government to get reparations for various Indian raids. Her first husband commits a notorious crime. Spoiler alert, he murders his second wife. So court records keep track of her first husband and her father. Historians and journalists are aware of her father. And then I'll tell a little bit about Sophie's life, but she ends up living the last half century of her life at Pine Ridge on a reservation. So the federal government is keeping pretty careful tabs on her there as well, because they're tracking who deserves rations, who's going to get land when the reservations are split up after the Dawes Act, et cetera, et cetera. So for a girl who starts out anonymous in this photograph, we can uncover a lot about her life. And just to put it in a nutshell, she marries when she's about 14. She marries a white Civil War veteran named Posey Ryan. With him, she has 5 children. When the youngest child is still nursing, Posey falls in love with a white woman and effectively kidnaps his own children and banishes young Sophie, who's then in her mid-20s, to the Pine Ridge Reservation. The children from that first marriage grow up in a white world, and some of them most of them really lose contact with their mother until they're adults. Sophie ends up at Pine Ridge, where she's briefly a laundress at the Oglala boarding school. She's working there on the day that Wounded Knee happens. She's probably there when the runners and the survivors from the massacre come running into Pine Ridge Agency to report on that massacre. And soon after that, she marries a person who, like her, is half Lakota, half white, a man named John Monroe, who in some cases is characterized as a juggler in traveling Wild West show and circus. But it turns out he's an extremely fluent speaker of archaic forms of Lakota, and he becomes one of the most sought-after translators when anthropologists begin coming to the reservation around the turn of the 20th century. So I like to think it's really ironic. Sophie grew up in a mixed-race world at her father's trading post out some miles from Fort Laramie. She didn't really grow up connected to her mother's Lakota world. But as a mother, and she has 8 children with her second husband, so that's 13 in all. As an adult, she begins reconnecting to Lakota culture at a moment when most Lakota people are losing knowledge of the old ways. Because her husband is coming home from work and saying, I spent all day interviewing a woman who knows how to build teepees. I spent all day learning how people used to hunt buffalo. So it's an ironic moment. She too lives a long time. She dies in 1936 at the height of the Great Depression in one of the poorest counties, one of the poorest regions of a depression-stricken America, in a small dugout house with a bearskin flapping over the front door, a detail that was provided to me by one of her great-grandchildren.
Even set the picture aside, a biography of her in and of itself, it is what a fascinating life that gives us glimpses into so many complicated historical narratives that her life is intersecting with, right? But this again speaks to the power of a photograph, and especially the power of a photograph that makes you try to seek out the identity of the people in it, because you never would have thought to, let's go explore the life of this name, right? But the question, the mystery of who is this, led you down this path, which uncovers a remarkable historic individual who lived a life that teaches us so much about so many different, bigger things.
Well, exactly. And I think one of the big lessons I take away from this book is that everyone's story matters. And, since finishing this book, since spending so many years working on this book, I'm always telling people, take out that shoebox and label your family photographs. Don't make it so hard for the next come along and try to figure out who that person is.
Rewinding a teeny bit, we were talking a little about entanglements, and
Mm-hmm.
I was really shocked by all the entanglements between these, I guess, 8 individuals, if we include the photographer, before, during, and after the photograph. But then as I stopped to think, a lot of the famous 19th century Western figures, you think about like Kit Carson or James Beckworth, Timothy O'Sullivan, another photographer, like they show up all over the place. They are they're highly mobile, they're everywhere, and they're entangled with so many different things. And so then I thought, well, the unnamed people were probably often similarly mobile all over the place. So maybe I shouldn't have been surprised that this photo or any other photo of a group of people, if you do the research, those people probably are entangled in all kinds of ways that were not legible necessarily in the photo.
Yeah, I mean, I really learned from this that the West was a big place, but a small world. In a way, it's not surprising that the white peace commissioners in the photograph had connected before. They connected during the Civil War. They were military leaders. They were in and out of Washington. Sometimes they were in similar battles, et cetera, et cetera. It shouldn't have surprised me that Gardner had photographed some of these men before in his studio in Washington. All of these men had been photographed before. Only the girl, I'm quite sure, had never seen a camera. But it did surprise me when I was researching Gardner's trip with the Kansas Pacific Railroad the year before, that Gardner literally ran into the peace commissioners at a military fort in Kansas. That shouldn't have surprised me because there was only so many ways you could travel around the West at this point. So the military forts were often near the train hubs. So people would travel on the train as far as they could, then get off and proceed, in wagons to where they wanted to go. So it's in a way not 100% surprising that he should just run into these people and recognize them from Washington, D.C. And that meeting the year before, I think, planted the seed of possibility for everyone that maybe, they should bring a photographer with them if they have to go back out West. But what really surprised me is that the Native people showing up to talk to the commissioners, they knew them too. Some of them were carrying around pieces of paper, kind of commendations or fruit passes that Harney had written for them 10, 15, 20 years before. They knew Harney because he had spent a lot of time out in this part of the world. So these men knew each other from West Point, from Washington, from the Civil War. But Native people knew them from previous treaty negotiations and from military encounters.
So maybe it's specific kind of nodes in these networks of, be it like physical locations, like railroad depots, military forts, or specific types of events like a peace commission or, like a rendezvous way back in the day where if individuals pass through one of those nodes, there's a very good chance that they now have connections with all kinds of other people but maybe it's the people then who did not interact at those nodes of contact that maybe aren't quite as interconnected, um, but those who were, so many are. I wanted to ask you a question as we're kind of probably reaching the end of our time, and I always apologize when I read people their own words, like quoting out of the book, because I always find that awkward. But I'm going to quote you. This is from towards the end. You write, "For some people whose stories intertwined at Fort Laramie in 1868, the treaty gathering was a small eddy in the river of their lives. For others, it was a rushing current that caught them in the undertow." Beautifully written, for first of all. But my question is, so when viewed in the context of the almost she lives for almost 70 more years, right, after this, into the Great Depression. I mean, speaking
Mhm.
of a life that spans so many unique eras. So when viewed in the broad context of her entire life, what do you think that this moment ended up representing for her? Was it just a small eddy, or was it something that caught her in a current, or somehow both?
Okay, well, this is the moment that creates the Great Sioux Reservation, which is later divided up into smaller reservations, including Pine Ridge. So this is the moment that's creating the political and administrative infrastructure, if you will, and that will govern the last half century of her life. She had grown up in a mixed race world, again with a white father and a Lakota mother. She and her brothers were at least bilingual, if not trilingual. I don't know if they spoke French, but they spoke English and Lakota. Her brothers become translators, actually. So she represents a kind of vibrant mixed race world that's living on the periphery of different Native communities as a child. But once she is forcibly removed to the reservation, which these men are in the process of creating, she's in a world where race is much more rigidly defined. She's in a world where if you're on a Native reservation and you're identified as a member of the tribe, you get certain rights, certain rations, certain potential access to land, certain limitations of other rights, absolutely. If you identify as mixed race and you're not on a reservation, you live actually under a different legal system. So yes, this is a moment that absolutely defines what will happen to her family over the coming decades.
I'm so glad we have it. And I mean, as with everything we do in history, we find a photo or a document and it gives us so much. And we just
Mhm.
wish, oh, like, why hadn't Alexander kept a
Mhm.
good journal about what he was thinking? Or like, why don't we have more, right? But we are so lucky to have what we do have. Okay, one final question. You already mentioned, kind of made this appeal to people to go into their shoe boxes and to write names on the backs of photos. So their kids don't have to. And I've had this discussion with my parents so many times, and they've done a pretty good job. But imagine that you're on your soapbox, you have a room full of people who, I don't know, just inherited a storage container full of a bunch of old boxes of dusty old documents and photos and whatnot. What do you tell them to do? Like, what are your instructions or what's your call to action? Because we all do. We all have some old shoebox in grandma's attic full of who knows what. Like, what should we do with it? Not just to benefit ourselves, but, the next generations.
Well, let's first of all note that many of the photographs we're making now are not going to end up in shoeboxes. So the photographs we make on our cell phones, which are we make, let me put it this way, we make more photographs before breakfast today on cell phones than were made in all of the 19th century. Okay, so we're just drowning in images now, but those digital images existing in bits and bytes out there in the ether are not going to survive as long as 19th century photographs have. So I want people to be mindful of what they're doing to preserve the pictures they're making now, because of course now is the history of the future, right? For the older photographs, on largely on paper, some much older ones on tin or copper or even glass, people need to identify them. And I would also encourage people to treasure those old items, put them in archival boxes, take care of them, but also digitize them. Create family Google Drives where you're uploading the Smith part of your family and the Brown part of your family and the white part of your family. I was thinking of names there, not races. So that all the cousins can see them, and that picture of the old woman at the picnic that you don't know, maybe your third cousin actually realizes that's their great grandmother, and through these shared image drives that your families are creating, they can begin to tag and identify those images too. So I'm not against new technology altogether. I think there's ways we can use it as a tool to better archive and understand our older pictures, but it all starts with people just identifying the subjects they can identify.
I've been doing that a lot myself over the last decade or so, digitizing old family negatives, and I'm trying to earn son-in-law of the year. By I mean, I've digitized, I mean, 10,000 plus photos from my in-laws, and I put them on a Google Drive. And at one point, I was handed a Ziploc bag of loose negatives, many of which were water damaged, and I pieced them all together, and I think I got them all in order, and we dated them. We'd look like, okay, so what's that poster in the background at this Christmas gathering? Oh, it's of a movie that came out in 1994, and so we're trying to date things. It's fun work, but it does take a lot of intentionality because
Mhm.
these things are, especially once we digitize them, they do become ephemeral and they might just be lost to time, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
So I appreciate this encouragement for me to continue doing that, and for others to start up if they haven't already.
Yeah. And can I add one thing, Brendan? Like, you never know where an old photograph is going to take you. Shortly after my book came out, I was contacted by a descendant of the evil General Harney, and I was sure he wanted to upbraid me for saying bad things about his ancestor. But no, he was thrilled that I had uncovered more examples of perfidy than he already knew about, because for 20 years, he has been working with a Lakota family that is descended from the man who ran the camp at Blue Water, where Harney executed his terrible massacre and inadvertently brought Sophie's parents together. He's been working for 20 years to atone for what his ancestor did. And the stars aligned. I happened to be in Washington, D.C. the day that, after 20 years, he and this Lakota family finally got to see the things that were collected on the massacre field at Blue Water. They were some of the very first artifacts to enter the Smithsonian. They were given to the Smithsonian in 1856. I was there, and they were drumming, they were smudging, they were weeping as they looked at the baby carriers and the shirts and the moccasins and the sewing kits that were collected on that massacre field. The family very much wanted the Smithsonian to return those artifacts to them in time for the anniversary of the Blue Water Massacre this September. It was the 170th anniversary. I just thought there's no chance the Smithsonian is going to give this material back, particularly in a day and age when the federal government is encouraging museums not to deal with some of the darker aspects of American history. But it happened. And I was at Blue Water in September of this year as these artifacts returned to the Little Thunder family. There was a pipe ceremony under the witness tree on the massacre field. And it was an extraordinary thing. And I thought I was writing about a picture made in 1868. Sophie died in 1936. I thought I was writing about a story that was over. But that experience of being there with those families, with the representatives from the Smithsonian, so powerfully reminded me that history matters and that history echoes into the present day. Back to those shoeboxes, you don't know what stories are in there, but be open to them.
Yeah, what a testimony to the power of this kind of work, and you don't know where it might lead to actually impact people's lives today in meaningful ways, not just well, gee whiz, we found out who's in this photo. It may end up leading to some revelation or about someone's family, them finding out information or deeply impacting them, in some special way today.
Yeah, I was going to say, I tell graduate students, don't ever start your dissertation this way. Don't start by asking, who's the girl in the photograph? Because you don't know. You don't know if you will find a story. So I feel incredibly lucky that I found a story, that I met the people I met, and that I completely inadvertently, as you said, found a story that still resonates today.
Which probably surpasses any glowing book review awards you might win. This is the kind of result that we so rarely get as historians, and it's probably the most meaningful.
It's very, very powerful experience.
Well, congrats on the book. I know it is being well received and reviewed and getting all of those other honors. So congrats on that, but especially for being able to be a part of that really special moment in September. That's really wonderful.
Thank you, Brendan. It's been a pleasure to speak with you today about the project.
Yeah, thank you so much for spending some time, and I hope we'll cross paths again sometime soon.
That would be great.
All right, take care, Marnie.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and please leave us whatever app or platform you're listening through, and follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or X, Twitter. On those platforms, you can get updates, leave comments, and share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream on our YouTube and Facebook pages, have an annual funding cycle with awards, grants, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone can apply for if they are researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product. Learn more at Redd Center, that's REDD Center.byu.edu. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. His website is also linked in the show notes. As the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, you can direct any praise or critique my way. I'm the author and editor of a number of books, articles, and chapters on the North American West, borderlands, Native peoples, genocide studies, religion, and the environment. My recent books include a 2018 volume, Native Foreign, Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in the North American Borderlands, which won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America. A 2019 anthology I co-edited with P. Jane Hafen, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, which won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association, and a 2022 collection of essays I edited entitled The North American West in the 21st Century. I also recently launched and will be editing a new series for the University of New Mexico Press entitled The West in Context. Send me a note if you have a manuscript to propose for publication. Here at the Red Center, I'm also the general editor and project manager of a great digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. It's a free mobile app and website, intermountainhistories.org, that curates student-researched and written micro-histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, or anything else, head to bwrensink.org, email me at bwrensink@byu.edu, or follow me on Blue Sky or X Twitter